The cameras ran for 61 nights before I checked them. By that point, whatever had been coming to the cabin had been recorded on 7 separate devices from 7 separate angles across a total of 43 of those 61 nights. When I sat down at my laptop and began pulling the footage, I told myself I was going to find deer, maybe a bear working the perimeter, drawn by the compost pile I'd been meaning to move for 2 years. What I found instead was documentation of a systematic nightly surveillance operation that had been running since October, conducted by something that understood where my windows were, understood where the cameras were, and on 11 separate occasions between 2 and 4 in the morning had stood at my front door and tested the handle. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We post a new story every single day. Thanks. My name is Walter Crane. Walter. I spent 26 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the last 14 of them as a senior wildlife biologist specializing in large carnivore behavior and habitat assessment in the Northern Rockies. I've spent more hours in the field studying predator movement patterns, territory marking, and hunting behavior than I can accurately calculate. I know how bears work. I know how mountain lions work. I know how wolves work, their travel corridors, their denning preferences, their seasonal behavioral shifts, the way a pack communicates territorial ownership across dozens of miles of landscape. I know what a predator's relationship with a fixed point of human habitation looks like over time, the approach distances, the habituation curve, the specific sequence by which a large carnivore that has identified a human structure as a potential food source begins incrementally reducing the buffer between itself and that structure. I know all of this because I spent more than 2 decades measuring it, documenting it, publishing findings on it in journals that are peer-reviewed and read by people whose entire professional identity is built around the rigorous analysis of animal behavior. I am telling you this not to impress you. I am telling you this so that when I describe what the footage showed, you understand that I am not a person who mistakes a bear for something else. I am not a person who sees a large, dark shape in a trail camera image and projects onto it a form that isn't there. I am a person who has spent the better part of 3 decades being professionally precise about what animals do, what they don't do, and where the hard boundary between those 2 categories lies. What I documented at my cabin in the Kootenai drainage that winter was outside that boundary in ways that I have not been able to resolve in the 3 years since. I had retired from the service 18 months before the first incident. The cabin had been in my family since my father built it in the early 1970s, a 3-room structure on 40 acres of private land bordered on 2 sides by national forest, at the end of a gravel road that sees no traffic after the hunting season closes in late November. I had been going there my entire life, first as a child, then as a field biologist, using it as a base of operations for survey work in the adjacent forest, then as a place to spend the long stretches between assignments that accumulate in a career that involves a great deal of remote work. When I retired, the decision to move there permanently felt like the most natural thing I had ever done. I was 61 years old. I was alone. My wife had died 4 years earlier, a fact I mention not for sympathy, but because it explains why I was the only person in that cabin, why the footage shows one man's routine and no other, and why the question of who was watching me had no answer that involved another human being. I knew my own comings and goings. I knew what my truck's headlights looked like sweeping across the tree line when I came home after dark. I knew the specific creak of the 3rd porch step and the way the wood stove draft changed when the wind shifted northwest. I knew this place with the accumulated specificity of a lifetime, and that is why the wrongness registered before I had any evidence to attach it to. It started in early October, which is when I normally settle in for the season. The elk hunters had cleared out, the gravel road had gone quiet, and the forest around the cabin returned to the particular quality of stillness that it holds from November through April, that deep pressurized silence that only arrives when the human traffic stops and the landscape reverts to its own rhythms. I have always loved that silence. It has always felt like a return to something honest. That October it felt different in a way I initially attributed to the adjustment of retirement, to the unfamiliar experience of being in that place without an operational agenda for the first time. The silence felt inhabited, not threatening, not alarming, just less empty than I expected it to be. The first concrete thing I noticed was the dog behavior. I had a shepherd mix named Amos, 11 years old, a dog that had spent his entire life in the field with me and was as steady and experienced an animal as I've ever worked with. He did not spook. He did not alarm bark at shadows or deer or the ordinary sounds of a Montana night. In 10 years of working remote terrain, he had never once refused to go outside after dark, not in wolf country, not in grizzly country, not in any of the landscapes we had worked together that contained genuine, large predator risk. In the second week of October, he began sitting at the back door at night instead of going through his dog door to the small fenced run I had built him. Not barking, not whining, just sitting there with his back to the door and his eyes on the interior of the cabin, and a quality of stillness in him that I had never seen before, and that I recognized, professionally, as the stillness of an animal that does not want to make itself known to something outside. I went out and walked the perimeter twice in the first week, looking for sign. Found nothing immediately diagnostic, some disturbed ground near the compost pile that could have been bare, some bark scoring on a pine at the cabin's northeast corner that was high and fresh, but within normal bare parameters. No tracks in the soft ground near the creek that crossed the southern edge of my property. Nothing that required a revision of the standard explanation. I made a note in my field journal, which I maintain out of habit even in retirement, that I would set cameras and monitor for bear activity over the following weeks. I had 3 trail cameras from my service work, good quality units with high-resolution night vision and motion activation. I deployed them on the second day of November, positioning them to cover the cabin's main approaches, the compost pile, and the tree line to the north where the disturbed bark had caught my attention. Then, I went about my life and did not think about them again with any urgency. I was a retired wildlife biologist. Deploying cameras and waiting for results was as natural and unremarkable as anything I did. I added 4 more cameras in mid-November. I cannot fully explain why. There had been no new sign, no new behavioral change in Amos beyond his continued reluctance to use his dog door after dark, no sound or disturbance in the night that demanded a response. I added them because something in the accumulated texture of those weeks had produced in me a low, persistent unease that I found easier to address practically than to examine directly. I ran the cables, tested the angles, adjusted the sensitivity settings, and went back inside and fed the wood stove and read a wildlife management journal from 1987 that I had been meaning to get to for 15 years. This is the kind of detail that feels absurd in retrospect. Outside my cabin, something that had apparently been visiting every other night for weeks was doing what it always did. Inside, I was reading management literature and telling myself that the discomfort I felt was an artifact of the adjustment to solitude. The first indication that something was wrong beyond the normal parameters of large predator habituation behavior, came not from the cameras, but from tracks. I found them on the morning of December 3rd, after a light snowfall the previous night had laid a clean recording surface across the frozen ground. They were on the north side of the cabin, running parallel to the wall at a distance of approximately 8 feet, and they were bipedal. Not a bear's bipedal trail, which I have seen many times and which has specific characteristics that are immediately recognizable. The wide drag between steps, the flat-footed impression, the relatively short stride for the animal's size. These were 2-point tracks, left foot and right foot in alternating single-file succession, with a stride length I measured at 62 inches and a depth in the 3-inch snowpack that indicated something considerably heavier than any man. The prints themselves were canine in the structure of the pad and the arrangement of the toes, but enlarged well beyond any canine I had ever documented, and the claw impressions were deep and consistent, not the intermittent ground contact of claws in extension that you get with a bear, but the fixed, load-bearing claw contact of something whose claws are always in contact with the ground when it walks. The track line ran the full length of the north wall, turned the corner at the northwest cabin corner, continued along the west wall to the point where the window of my bedroom is located, stopped there, The depth of the impressions at that stop point was noticeably greater, suggesting a period of stationary weight-bearing that the moving tracks didn't show, and then turned north and disappeared into the timber. I stood in that snow for a long time. I had my phone in my hand and I had taken photographs, and I was looking at those photographs and running every alternative hypothesis I had against the physical evidence in front of me and eliminating them in sequence the way I had been trained to do. Bear, eliminated. Gait pattern wrong, toe arrangement wrong, claw contact pattern wrong. Known canid, eliminated. Scale incompatible with any documented species by a factor that cannot be attributed to measurement error. Human, eliminated. Stride geometry and foot morphology inconsistent. Unknown canid on all fours, eliminated. The bipedal stride pattern is produced by a different weight distribution than a quadruped moving on two limbs temporarily, and these tracks showed the centered, balanced, efficient weight distribution of habitual bipedal locomotion. What I was looking at was a large, bipedal, canine-footed animal that had walked along two sides of my cabin and stopped to stand at my bedroom window in the dark. The professional part of my brain produced this conclusion methodically and without drama. The other part of my brain, the older part, had arrived at it considerably faster and had been standing very quietly at the back of my mind for the past 6 weeks, waiting. I went inside, and I checked the cameras were recording, and I made a large pot of coffee, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought carefully about what to do next. Amos sat beside my chair with his chin on my knee, which he had not done since the week my wife died, when he had stationed himself against me with the specific gravity of an animal that understands something is wrong and has decided that proximity is the only contribution available to him. I drank the coffee and I thought, and at some point I realized my hands were completely steady on the mug, which surprised me, and then I realized that the steadiness was not composure, but numbness, the body's way of managing information that the mind has not yet fully processed. I had found the track of something that should not exist. I'd found it 8 feet from my bedroom window, and I had 61 nights of camera footage waiting on 7 devices that I had not yet reviewed. I did not review it that day. I reviewed it the following morning, after a night in which I slept approximately 3 hours in 2 separate intervals and spent the remaining time listening to the forest outside with the specific, straining attention of a man who has spent his career listening to forests, and who now needed that expertise to tell him something it had never been called upon to say before. The forest gave me nothing. No sound beyond the ordinary, no movement that the window revealed. Amos slept against the bedroom door, not on his bed, with his nose at the gap beneath it. I noted that detail in my journal at 2 a.m. in handwriting that was less steady than usual. Then, I waited for dawn. I pulled the footage in chronological order, which is the only way to review behavioral documentation if you want the data to mean anything. Start at the beginning. Watch the baseline establish itself, note the deviations as they accumulate. That is how you build a picture of an animal's relationship with a fixed point over time. And that is what I did, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and a coffee that went cold before I had gotten through the first 2 weeks of recordings. I treated it the way I would have treated any behavioral data set. I took notes. I logged timestamps. I was precise. I needed to be precise because the alternative, allowing myself to react emotionally to what I was seeing as I saw it, would have meant stopping. And stopping was not something I was prepared to do. The first appearance was on the 4th night after I deployed the initial 3 cameras, November 5th, at 2:47 in the morning. Camera 2, positioned to cover the north approach to the cabin along the tree line, recorded 11 seconds of footage. The motion sensor had triggered on something moving at the far left edge of the frame, and for the first 8 seconds of the clip there was nothing visible in the central field. Just the tree line, just the frost-rimed ground, just the blue-white cast of the infrared illumination lying flat across the snow. Then, in the upper right quadrant of the frame, at the extreme edge of the camera's useful range, something was there that had not been there in the preceding frame. I paused the footage. I enlarged the image. The resolution degraded with the enlargement, but the shape held. Tall. Upright. The suggestion of a broad-shouldered silhouette against the darker mass of the timber behind it, positioned at a distance I estimated at 40 yards from the camera. Motionless. facing the camera directly. I wrote in my notes, large upright figure, north tree line, stationary, facing camera, 0247 hours, duration of visibility in frame approximately 3 seconds. I underlined stationary. I underlined facing camera. Then I moved to the next clip. It appeared on camera 2 again 2 nights later, closer this time by roughly 10 yards. Same hour of the morning, within a 20-minute window of the previous appearance, which told me something about its activity schedule. Same orientation, facing the camera, not moving through the frame but positioned in it as if it had come to a specific point and stopped there with intention. The clip ran for 19 seconds, and for all 19 seconds, the figure stood still. At the end of the clip, the motion sensor timed out and the camera stopped recording, and when the next triggered clip began 14 seconds later, the figure was gone. It had moved out of range in 14 seconds from a standing start at 40 yards. I noted that. I noted the arithmetic of it. 14 seconds, 40 yards, and no audio of movement in the intervening clip despite the crisp acoustic conditions of a cold, still November night. By the end of the first 2 weeks of footage, a pattern had fully articulated itself. It came on average every other night, always between 1 and 4 in the morning. Always to the north side of the cabin first, always at camera 2's position or near it, as if the north approach was a habitual entry route into the cabin's immediate vicinity. From the north it would move, and here is where the footage became genuinely difficult to sit with, around the cabin's perimeter in a counterclockwise direction, appearing sequentially on camera 5, which covered the west wall, then camera 3, which covered the south approach, then sometimes camera 1 at the east tree line before returning north. It was circumnavigating the structure. Every visit, methodically, at a pace that suggested deliberate inspection rather than random movement, pausing at specific points that it returned to with enough consistency that I could predict which frames would show a stationary figure and which would show nothing. One of those pause points was the northwest corner where the bedroom window is. I have already told you that the tracks in the December snow showed a deeper impression at that location, the physical evidence of stationary weight-bearing. The footage confirmed it from mid-November onward. Every circumnavigation included a stop at that corner. The duration varied, sometimes 30 seconds, once nearly 4 minutes on a night in late November when the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and the camera's infrared caught the vapor of its breath rising in slow, even plumes above the window frame. And I sat at my kitchen table looking at that image and understanding that I had been asleep on the other side of that wall on 23 separate documented occasions while this was happening outside. The breath plumes were thick and steady, not the rapid respiration of an animal in flight or pursuit, slow, patient, the breathing of something that was comfortable, something that felt no urgency about being where it was. The handle incidents were on cameras 6 and 7, which I had deployed at the end of November specifically to cover the front porch, after I had noticed, on my third full review of the earlier footage, that camera 5's angle did not capture the porch door. A gap in coverage. I had filled it without fully articulating to myself why a gap in coverage at the front door felt like a problem that needed solving. The footage from camera 6 answered that question on the third night after deployment, December 1st, 3:18 in the morning. The figure came up the porch steps, 3 steps, and I watched it navigate them with a fluid, unhurried ease that took no account of the darkness, placed each foot with precision, did not use the railing, and crossed to the door and stood before it. The camera angle was from the porch eave, looking down and slightly south, and it gave me the clearest view I had yet had of the figure in anything close to proximity. 7 feet and some additional inches of height, fur that was dark brown shading to near black across the shoulders and upper back. The head was canine, unmistakably, with an elongated muzzle and ears that sat high and tracked independently as the figure stood at the door, rotating to sweep the surrounding darkness the way radar sweeps, continuously and without the fixed attention that a nervous animal shows. The eyes caught the infrared and threw it back in a flat amber reflection that appeared in 2 frames before the angle shifted. The shoulders were enormous. The arms hung at a length that was wrong for anything I had ever documented, past where human arms end and then further. It raised its right hand to the door handle. I watched this happen on a 4-inch laptop screen in my kitchen at 9 o'clock on a winter morning, and I stopped the footage and sat back in my chair and breathed carefully for approximately 2 minutes before I could continue. The hand was not a paw. It was a hand in the functional sense, 5 digits, an opposable structure on the inside, capable of the specific rotational grip required to engage a lever-style door handle. It closed on the handle and applied pressure in the downward arc that the handle required, and the door moved fractionally inward before the bolt stopped it. The figure held that pressure for 3 seconds, then released, then applied it again, then released. Testing. Not rattling the handle in the blind way that bears engage with structures. Bears push, bash, pry, apply undifferentiated force. This was the specific, directed, evaluative pressure of something that understood the mechanism and was assessing it. It tried the handle 4 times on that first night, each attempt identical in force and direction, as if it was confirming a consistent result, rather than hoping a different approach would yield a different outcome. Then it released, turned, descended the porch steps the same way it had ascended them, and moved north into the timber. It came back to the door on 10 subsequent nights between December 1st and the 17th. Each visit identical in its methodical quality. The circumnavigation first, the pause at the bedroom window, the approach to the porch, the handle. On the 7th visit, it tried both the handle and then the base of the door, applying upward pressure from below in a way that tested whether the bottom of the door could be moved independently of the bolt, which on a properly hung door it cannot. On the 9th visit, it stood at the door for 11 minutes without touching the handle at all, and the camera recorded it standing there in the dark, and I could not determine from the footage what it was doing or thinking during those 11 minutes, and I am still not sure whether that uncertainty makes the footage more or less frightening than if it had been trying the handle again. On the 11th visit, it brought something with it. If you have found this account worth your time, if these nights in that cabin mean something to you, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. We put out a new story every single day. What it brought and what happened after I understood what that meant is the part that changed everything. Camera 7, positioned to cover the porch from the south angle, captured it more clearly than Camera 6 on that 11th night. It came up the steps with something in its right hand, something long and narrow that it carried loosely at its side the way a person carries a walking stick, except that the object was not a walking stick. It was a branch, roughly 4 feet long, stripped of its smaller side growth, with one end sharpened to a rough point by what I would later establish. From examining a matching object I found at the edge of the timber the following morning, was done by a combination of biting and scraping with a stone edge. A tool. Not an elaborate tool, not the sophisticated hafted point technology that some accounts describe, but a shaped implement deliberately modified from raw material for a specific purpose, carried to my door and held at its side while it tested my handle for the 11th time. I watched it try the handle, hold the sharpened branch loosely at its side while it did so, release the handle, stand for 2 minutes at the door, then turn and walk back down the steps and north toward the timber, branch still in hand, until the infrared range ended and the darkness took it. I closed my laptop. I sat in the kitchen without moving for a period of time I cannot accurately report because I was not tracking it. Amos had been lying under the table during the entire review, and at some point during that interval, he put his chin on my boot, which was the same thing he had done during those first bad weeks after my wife died, and I reached down and put my hand on his head, and we stayed like that for a while. I am 64 years old. I have spent my professional life in proximity to animals that can kill a person without particular effort. I have been charged by grizzlies. I have been in the field alone in wolf territory in conditions where the nearest other human being was 2 days' walk away. I have never been afraid of wild animals in the way that people who haven't spent time with them are afraid, because familiarity with the specific vocabulary of animal behavior produces a kind of working confidence. You know the signals, you know the margins, you know how to read the situation and respond appropriately. That confidence had been one of the things I valued most about the career I had built, and sitting in that kitchen with my hand on my dog's head and 61 nights of camera footage in my laptop, I understood that it was gone. Not because the thing outside was more physically dangerous than a grizzly, though it may have been, because it was doing something that no animal I had ever studied does. It was learning, not in the incremental, instinct-driven way that animals habituate to human presence over time, but in the way that a person learns when they are working on a problem. It had found my cabin. It had established an inspection routine. It had identified the specific features of the structure that were relevant to its interests: the bedroom window, the door, the lock mechanism. It had brought a tool to the door on a night when no tool would have been necessary for simple handle testing, which suggested the tool was for something other than the handle. It had spent 11 minutes at the door on the 9th visit doing nothing I could document, which suggested a cognitive process that the camera could not record. And it had done all of this with a patience and a consistency and a methodical quality that meant it was going to keep doing it until something changed. The lock was a standard residential deadbolt. I had never upgraded it because nothing in 20 years of living beside a national forest had ever suggested the need. I thought about that for a long time in the kitchen. Then I got up and found my truck keys and drove 4 hours to the nearest hardware store and bought a steel security door and the hardware to install it, and drove 4 hours back in the dark. And the whole drive, I was thinking about the 11 minutes at the door on the 9th visit. I was thinking about what a patient, intelligent, problem-focused mind does with 11 minutes of uninterrupted examination of a problem it intends to solve. I was thinking about the sharpened branch. I was thinking about the fact that I had been asleep on 23 documented nights, 6 feet from a window where something with amber eyes and a sharpened stick had stood in the dark and breathed slowly in the cold air and looked in. I installed the security door that night by headlamp, working in the 12-degree cold with hands that were steady in the way that hands are steady when the mind is committed to a course of action and the body is simply executing it. When I was done, I went inside and I fed the wood stove, and I sat at the table and I thought about what to do next with what I had. What I had was footage. 43 nights of documented visits across 7 camera angles, totaling several hundred individual clips. I had the track photographs from the December snowfall, measured and GPS logged. I had the sharpened branch, which I had retrieved from the timber the morning after the 11th door visit and sealed in a contractor bag and stored in my truck bed, and which showed clear evidence of intentional modification. Bite pressure marks at the sharpening point consistent with large canine dentition, lateral scoring along the shaft, consistent with a stone edge, drawn repeatedly against the grain of the wood. I had 26 years of professional credentials in large carnivore behavioral analysis, and I had in my field journal 61 consecutive nights of observational notes written in the careful, specific language of a scientist who had not yet fully admitted to himself what he was observing, but had been recording it accurately anyway. Because accuracy is what the training produces, even when the training has no framework for the thing being recorded. The question of what to do with all of it was harder than it should have been. I had spent my entire career inside a federal agency. I knew how evidence moved through institutional channels. I knew who the relevant contacts were, what the reporting protocols looked like, which regional offices handled unusual wildlife encounters, and which division within the service handled incidents that fell outside standard categorization. I also knew from 26 years of watching how federal land management agencies respond to findings that complicate the public relationship with national forests and parks, that what I was about to put in front of those institutions was not going to be received the way that evidence is supposed to be received. I knew it the way you know things that your career has taught you without anyone ever saying them directly. I made the call anyway. I sent an email to my former regional supervisor, a man I had worked closely with for 11 years, a rigorous scientist whom I respected and trusted. I described what I had in factual terms, kept the language clinical and specific, and attached 6 still frames extracted from the footage that I felt best represented the behavioral pattern I had documented. I did not use any specific terminology that would categorize what I was describing. I let the evidence speak in the language of behavioral field documentation and waited to see how he received it. He called me 4 hours later. The call lasted 22 minutes. He was careful, professional, and clearly troubled, not by the footage itself, but by what having received it now required of him. He asked several questions that were good questions, the questions of a scientist evaluating evidence, and I answered them the same way, and at the end of that exchange, I believe he understood what I had. Then he told me that he was going to need to bring in some additional people for a consultation, and that I should hold the footage and the physical evidence and not share them outside that conversation until he came back to me. He used the phrase chain of custody, which in the context of a phone call about what I had described was a significant choice of language. It told me he was already thinking about this in terms of containment rather than investigation. I noted it and said nothing and told him I would wait to hear from him. The additional people arrived 8 days later. Not my regional supervisor. 2 people I had never met, a man and a woman, both of whom presented credentials from a division of the Department of the Interior that I had known existed in an administrative sense, but had never had direct contact with during my career. They arrived in a service vehicle, which was how I knew the call had gone up the chain faster than I had expected and had been redirected in a direction that my former supervisor had not initiated and possibly had not anticipated. They were polite. They were technically fluent. The man knew enough about camera trap methodology to ask intelligent questions about my deployment decisions, and the woman asked about the track measurements with the specific vocabulary of someone who understood track morphology. They watched the footage on my laptop for approximately 3 hours, taking notes, occasionally asking me to replay specific clips, and during those 3 hours I watched their faces with the same careful attention I had spent 40 years directing at animals in the field, looking for the involuntary physiological signals that reveal what a creature is actually processing beneath its displayed behavior. What I saw was recognition, not surprise. They were not scientists encountering anomalous data for the first time and working to integrate it. They were people looking at something they had a prior category for, confirming details, filling in specifics. The recognition was most visible on the woman's face when I played the clip of the 11th door visit, the one with the branch. She watched it twice without being asked, her expression controlled, but her stillness slightly too deliberate, the stillness of someone managing a reaction rather than simply not having one. When it finished the second time, she wrote something in her notebook and drew a line under it. I did not ask what she had written. I knew the question would not be answered. At the end of the 3 hours, they asked for copies of all footage, all track photographs, and the physical specimen, which was how they referred to the branch, the physical specimen, in the careful distancing language of classification. I provided everything. I had made my own copies and stored them in 3 separate locations before they arrived, which is a decision I made without fully articulating it to myself at the time, but which I have never regretted. They also asked me to sign documentation that they described as standard incident reporting protocol for sensitive wildlife encounters. There were 2 documents. The first was a reporting form that reduced 61 nights of behavioral documentation to a single paragraph describing an unidentified large mammal exhibiting unusual approach behavior toward an occupied structure. The second was a non-disclosure agreement that covered, in language that took me 4 readings to fully parse, all observations made in connection with the incident, including but not limited to footage, physical evidence, and the behavioral and cognitive characteristics of the entity observed. That phrase again. The entity observed. I had seen it in the cabin script documentation from a previous contact, and I saw it here, and it told me the same thing it had told me then, that somewhere in the federal bureaucracy there was a filing system with a specific drawer for this, and the drawer was not empty. I signed. I have asked myself many times since whether I should have refused, and I arrive each time at the same place, which is that refusing would have changed nothing about what they took with them, and would have changed a great deal about what happened to me in the months that followed. I signed, and they left before noon, and by 2 o'clock, my former supervisor had called to tell me the matter was being handled at a level above his office, and that he appreciated my professionalism in how I had managed it, and that he hoped I was enjoying retirement. His voice had a quality that I recognized from the rare occasions in my career when I had watched a good scientist be asked to look away from something he had seen clearly. A careful, contained resignation. I told him I was enjoying retirement, and we said goodbye and have not spoken since. The cameras are still on the property. I redeployed them after the government team left, repositioning them slightly, adjusting the angles. The visit stopped for 22 days after the team's presence at the cabin, which I attributed to the disruption of unfamiliar human activity and the scent footprint of multiple strangers moving through the area. On the 23rd day, the north approach camera triggered at 2:51 in the morning. The figure was back at the edge of the tree line, 40 yards out, upright, still, facing the camera. Whether it had simply resumed a pattern that was interrupted, or whether 22 days represented an assessment period, a determination that the strangers had left and the structure's occupant was again alone, I cannot say with certainty. I can say that the behavioral literature on territorial large carnivores supports a capacity for exactly that kind of patient, multi-week situational monitoring. I can also say that the literature was written about animals, and that whatever is on my camera is operating well beyond the cognitive margins that literature was designed to describe. It has come back 47 times since the government team's visit. The methodology has not changed. The circumnavigation, the pause at the bedroom window, the approach to the porch. The steel security door has been tested on 19 of those visits, and the testing has evolved. It no longer applies the simple downward handle pressure of the early visits. It now explores the door frame itself, running fingers along the gap between door and frame at the hinge side and the bolt side, applying lateral pressure at the points where the frame's resistance to the door's movement would be structurally weakest. It understands the door is different. It is figuring out how the difference works. On 3 occasions, it has brought objects to the porch, different objects each time. None of them is clearly modified as the branch, but all of them suggesting a deliberate selection from the available material in the surrounding timber rather than an accidental acquisition. It is not doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result. It is doing systematically different things and observing the results. That is not animal behavior. I need you to understand that. I have spent 26 years defining, measuring, and publishing on the boundaries of animal cognition in large North American carnivores. And what I am describing is not inside those boundaries. I have not left the cabin. This decision requires some explanation, because a reasonable person's first response to everything I have described is that a reasonable person would leave. I have thought about this carefully and at length, and I have arrived at several conclusions that, taken together, explain my position. The first is that I am 64 years old, and this is my home and the land my father built on, and the place where I have spent the most honest years of my life, and I am not willing to be displaced from it by something that is not, in 43 original visits and 47 subsequent ones, moved from assessment to action. The second is that my professional judgment, which I am not prepared to abandon simply because the current subject exceeds its prior parameters, tells me that this behavior is not prelude to attack. It is something else, something I do not have a word for, something that sits in a category I have been constructing slowly across 3 years of footage and observation, and that I am not yet ready to name. The third is that Amos is 11 years old and has approximately 1 or 2 good years left and does not travel well. And I am not going to spend his last years in a motel room in Missoula because something in the timber has decided my cabin is interesting. He sleeps against the bedroom door, and I sleep 6 feet from the window, and in the morning I feed the wood stove and review the overnight footage with my coffee and note the relevant details in my journal the way I have been trained to note things my entire professional life. I'm telling this story now because of something that happened 6 weeks ago, something that the non-disclosure agreement I signed arguably covers, and that I have decided falls outside the spirit of what I signed, if not its letter. On the 41st post-team visit, on a night in early February when the temperature was 7 degrees and the snow was fresh and the acoustic conditions were perfect, the figure stood at my bedroom window for 8 minutes. I was awake, as I often am during the window hours. I lay in the dark and listened to the slow, patient rhythm of its breath condensing and dispersing against the glass. A sound I can now hear through the wall when conditions are right. A sound that I have learned the way you learn the sounds of any animal you have spent sufficient time in proximity to. For 8 minutes I lay still, and it breathed on my window, and neither of us moved. Then it did something it had not done in 90 nights of documented visits. It made a sound. Not the vocalization reports described from encounter witnesses, not the howl or the scream or the rage sound of something in attack mode. A single, low, resonant sound that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and that had within it a pattern of tonal variation that my brain, before I could prevent it, parsed as intentional, as directed, the kind of sound that carries specific content to those equipped to receive it. I do not know what the content was. I know that it was aimed at the window. I know that I was on the other side of the window. And I know that in 26 years of field work, in thousands of hours of direct observation of large carnivore behavior at close range, I have never had an animal address me. Whatever produced that sound was not addressing the window, or the structure, or the darkness on my side of the glass. It knew I was there. It was speaking to me. I do not know what it said. I am working on that question. I expect I will be working on it for some time. If you are in a rural or forested area, if you have a structure in a location that sees limited human traffic across long seasonal stretches, if your animals have begun refusing to go out at night without a reason you can explain, I am asking you to install cameras. Not because I believe what is watching my cabin is watching yours. I have no evidence for that, and I will not speculate beyond my evidence. I am asking because I spent 23 nights asleep 6 feet from that window without knowing. And what changed between the 23rd night and the morning I reviewed the footage was not the situation. The situation had been in place for weeks. What changed was my knowledge of it. Knowledge is the only instrument that has ever made a genuine difference in the relationship between human beings and the wild systems we live inside. I have spent a career on that premise. Everything that has happened in this cabin over the past 3 years has confirmed it in ways I did not anticipate and am still working to absorb. My name is Walter Crane. I know large carnivore behavior better than almost anyone alive. I do not know what is coming to my cabin, but I have it on camera, in detail, across 3 years of methodical documentation, and I am telling you it is there, and it is patient, and it is paying attention. It has been paying attention since October. It has not stopped. Whatever it is waiting for, it has not decided it has arrived yet. I am not sure whether that is reassuring or the most frightening thing I know.